The smile before the strike was what everyone in the square remembered when the dust finally settled. It was not the sound of bone-meeting flesh, nor was it the heavy thud of a body hitting the grass that stayed etched in their memories. It was that gloating, arrogant grin under the midday carnival lights. Tyler Vance stood center stage on the festival grounds wearing a crisp crimson and cream Letterman jacket. His heavily tattooed forearms flexed deliberately as a heavy gold timepiece caught the glaring sun. Spectators pulled out their phones, children scrambled onto wooden benches for a better view, and the upbeat music thumping from the nearby food trucks was abruptly drowned out by a single venomous remark. "I'll drop you right here in front of your daughter," Tyler sneered. 10 feet away stood Arthur Cole, utterly motionless. He possessed none of the swagger or polished look of a trained fighter. Instead, he wore faded denim jeans, scuffed work boots, and a simple, clean, forest green button-down shirt that his daughter Chloe had picked out specifically because she thought it made him look a little less exhausted. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his hands bore the permanent grease stains and calluses of a man who spent his life wrestling with heavy machinery rather than posing for promotional cameras. To the gathered onlookers, he cut the tragic figure of an overworked, worn-out single father who had accidentally stumbled into a lion's den. Directly behind him, Chloe gripped the fabric of his sleeve so tightly that her knuckles turned in stark, bloodless white. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let's just go home." Tyler let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "You hear that? Little Princess wants Daddy to run away before he gets hurt," he shouted to the surrounding faces. Nervous chuckles rippled through the onlookers, the uneasy laughter people produce when they witness casual cruelty, but desperately hope the spotlight won't shift to them next. Without a dramatic word or an aggressive chest puff, Arthur calmly shifted his body to place Chloe safely behind his shoulder. His expression remained an impenetrable mask of quiet fatigue. He didn't raise his voice to match the challenger's bravado. He simply looked the young man dead in the eyes and said, "Son, you still have enough time to turn around and walk away." That calm warning only provoked Tyler into stepping closer, closing the distance with predatory confidence. Yet near the very back of the tightening circle, an elderly, weathered martial arts instructor named Silas Vance, no relation, though the shared surname had always been an ironic burden, suddenly stopped breathing normally. Silas stared hard at Arthur's face, tracing the faint, jagged white scar slicing through his right knuckle, before dropping his gaze to the unnervingly balanced, relaxed way Arthur's boots rested on the turf. "Oh no," Silas muttered under his breath, his blood running cold. "Not him." But his warning was completely swallowed by the ambient noise as everyone else remained fixated on Tyler. The crowd had completely misjudged the room, convinced that the tattooed media darling MMA fighter was the most dangerous creature present. They were about to learn how devastatingly wrong a first impression could be. It was the kind of humid summer afternoon where the air felt thick enough to chew, and the asphalt in the parking lot radiated a dull, shimmering heat that made the horizon warp. I stood near the edge of the community fairgrounds, wiping a layer of sticky sweat from my forehead, wearing an old canvas apron and the faded baseball cap I usually reserved for working in the yard. Around me, families were crowded tightly together. Children were squealing as they darted between wooden game booths, and the deep-fried scent of funnel cakes hung heavy in the breeze. For a brief, deceptive window of 20 minutes, things felt almost normal. My 12-year-old daughter Chloe had actually smiled, a genuine, unguarded flash of happiness, when I accidentally dropped a dollop of mustard right down the front of my shirt while we shared a quick lunch. Ever since her mother passed away 18 months ago, Chloe had retreated into a shell so profound and quiet that it terrified me on a cellular level. She still went to middle school. She still did her homework at the kitchen table without being asked, and whenever I gently pushed for too much conversation, she would offer the exact same deflection. "Dad, I'm fine." But any parent who has ever looked into a grieving child's eyes knows the vast, aching chasm between genuine peace and a broken kid desperately trying to shield you from their agony. That Saturday morning, when she had wandered out into my woodworking shed and quietly asked if we could check out the neighborhood festival down on 4th Street for just a single hour, I dropped my tools immediately. Unpaid electric bills could wait, but my daughter's fragile spark of life could not. We walked the dusty perimeter, bought a lukewarm lemonade, and watched the afternoon sunlight dance across her face until everything shattered right next to the local youth sports demonstration arena. That fenced-in canvas mat was the domain of Tyler Vance, a 24-year-old local celebrity whose father owned the largest commercial real estate firm and funded half the town's municipal events. Tyler possessed regional martial arts titles, a trail of online followers, and the casual, untouchable arrogance of someone who believed the entire world existed purely to applaud his reflection. He loved winning, but he clearly enjoyed making people feel small even more. Chloe had been stepping back to avoid a sudden rush of teenagers when she accidentally bumped shoulders with a passing spectator, sending her cup of lemonade splashing directly across the front of Tyler's expensive, custom-embroidered crimson athletic jacket. A tight circle of curious onlookers formed around them in a matter of seconds. "I'm so sorry," Chloe whispered, her voice immediately shrinking into a frightened squeak as she stared at the dark stain. "I didn't mean to do it." Tyler looked down at his sleeve, then slowly lifted his gaze toward a friend who already had a smartphone raised, recording every second for social media clout. "Well," Tyler announced loudly, projecting his voice so the surrounding crowd could savor the humiliation. "Looks like a clumsy little kid just ruined a jacket that cost more than your father makes in a month." I heard the sudden, sharp shift in Chloe's breathing before I even processed the words, and by the time I stepped through the barrier of onlookers to place myself squarely between them, my daughter looked as if the ground beneath her feet had completely dissolved into nothingness. The air around us seemed to freeze as Tyler sneered down at my terrified daughter, his posture shifting from casual arrogance to predatory amusement as he recognized her from the local diner where she worked evening shifts to help me pay the household bills. I could feel the cold panic radiating from Chloe's hand, where she still clung desperately to my fingers, and the sudden realization that my child had been targeted, harassed, and frightened in the shadows outside her workplace hit me harder and deeper than any physical blow ever could. A father can absorb a lot of things. He can swallow public humiliation, shrug off financial ruin, and tolerate being mocked by strangers who know nothing of his life. But realizing that your quiet, grieving daughter has been suffering alone in the dark is an entirely different kind of agony. Tyler stepped even closer, invading our personal space with that disgusting, entitled grin, completely unaware that the atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted from an amusing spectacle to something terrifyingly volatile. I stepped directly into his path, locking my body between him and Chloe, and my voice dropped into a low, quiet register that made the hair on the back of his arms stand up. "Today," I said, every word weighted with a quiet finality, "you are going to stop talking to my daughter right now." The immediate circle of onlookers went dead silent, the nervous chuckles evaporating into the heavy summer air, as they finally sensed the underlying danger they had been too blind to notice before. Silas Vance, the elderly martial arts trainer who had been watching from the periphery, pushed his way through the dense cluster of bodies with a look of absolute panic etched across his wrinkled face. "Arthur, stop!" Silas called out, his voice cracking with a desperate urgency that defied his years. "Just walk away from this kid, please." Tyler spared a brief, dismissive glance toward the old man, scoffing as he shook his head. "What? Does the old timer want to join the fan club too? Stay out of it, Grandpa." But Silas kept his worried, bloodshot eyes locked entirely on me, ignoring the rich kid completely. "Kid," Silas said, his voice trembling as he gestured toward me, "you have no idea who you're messing with." My jaw clenched, and I shot Silas a warning look to keep his mouth shut about my past. But the damage to the illusion of my ordinary life was already done. Tyler let out a short, mocking bark of laughter, completely misinterpreting the tension in the air. "Oh, wonderful! So the old man has a little cheering section. What's next? Are you going to cry?" Without saying another word, I slowly reached out and placed my hand directly on Tyler's shoulder, where his fingers had aggressively shoved me moments earlier. Using just a fraction of my true strength, I applied precise leverage to his wrist and rotator cuff, forcing his gripping hand to unlatch from my shirt against his own will. Only Tyler felt the terrifying absolute control behind that subtle movement. For half a second, the color completely drained from his face as his muscles betrayed him, before his bruised ego forced him to violently jerk backward to save face in front of his cheering friends. "Get on the mat!" Tyler hissed, his voice pitching up with sudden humiliation as he pointed a shaking finger toward the enclosed fighting canvas. "What's the matter, big guy? Too scared to back it up?" I glanced down at Chloe, whose pale face was etched with absolute terror as she begged me with her eyes not to engage. Being called a coward by a spoiled brat costs nothing in the grand scheme of life, but losing control, stepping back onto a fighting surface, and unleashing the violent instincts I had spent over a decade burying would cost me everything that truly mattered. "I don't prove anything to boys," I replied flatly, turning my back on him to walk away with my daughter. The tension in the open-air pavilion was thick enough to choke on, vibrating with the collective realization of what Tyler really was and what I was capable of doing if pushed past my absolute breaking point. Silas Vance stood frozen a few feet away, his chest heaving as the crushing weight of old history and deep regret washed over his lined face, realizing that the quiet mechanic he had just warned was the very same legendary figure the local fighting circuits had whispered about a decade ago. Chloe was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, her gaze darting from my relaxed stance to the faint, jagged scar across my knuckles, as if she were looking at a total stranger hiding inside her father's skin. Tyler, meanwhile, was slowly recovering from the initial shock of having his wrist effortlessly manipulated, his bruised ego instantly screaming for vengeance as he realized how humiliating it was to be neutralized so effortlessly in front of the dozens of local teenagers and peers recording the entire confrontation on their phones. The crowd had gone deadly quiet, no longer offering nervous chuckles or mocking whispers, because they finally understood that the stakes had shifted from a petty playground dispute to something entirely real and dangerous. Tyler's chest heaved with ragged breaths as he looked around, desperate to claw back his dominant standing before his carefully curated reputation evaporated into thin air. "You think you're clever because you've got a cheap parlor trick," Tyler barked, his voice cracking slightly with unadulterated panic as he backed up a half step. I didn't offer a dramatic speech or raise my fists into a defensive posture. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my green shirt, keeping my breathing slow and steady, refusing to give him the theatrical fight he so desperately wanted to broadcast to the world. "I'm done talking," I said quietly, reaching back to take Chloe's cold, trembling hand so we could finally turn our backs on the spectacle and walk away toward the parking lot. But Tyler wasn't willing to let it end with a bruised ego. With a sudden, vicious snarl, he lunged forward and slammed his heavy hand directly into my shoulder, spinning me back around with enough force to make Chloe cry out in alarm. The sudden violence of the shove echoed loudly across the open courtyard, sending a shockwave through the gathered onlookers who had foolishly thought this was just another harmless public confrontation. I caught my balance after taking a heavy half-step backward, my boots sliding slightly on the trodden grass, but I refused to let go of Chloe's hand. Tyler stood there with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily, his face flushed with the toxic adrenaline of a bully who believed he had just asserted dominance in front of an audience. The crowd parted further, murmuring nervously as they raised their phones higher, eager to capture every second of what they assumed was an inevitable street fight. I looked down at my hands for a fraction of a second, feeling the familiar, terrifying itch of muscle memory, the deeply ingrained reflexes of a man who had spent years inside caged rings before walking away from the applause, the blood, and the violence. For one split second, the temptation to drop him right there on the grass flared hot and bright in my chest. But then I looked at Chloe, whose pale, frightened eyes were locked onto my face, silently pleading with me not to become the monster everyone expected. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the red mist recede as quickly as it had arrived, and bent down to pick up the fallen dollar bills and grocery receipts that had been scattered across the dirt moments earlier. A few people in the front row laughed derisively, whispering cruel remarks about a grown man picking up pocket change from the grass. I ignored them completely, folding the worn currency with steady fingers and sliding it back into my wallet. "We are leaving, Tyler," I said, my voice entirely devoid of fear or anger. Tyler smirked, interpreting my restraint as absolute weakness, and stepped directly into our path again to block our escape. "Oh, what's the matter, old man? Does Daddy need to tuck his tail and run?" Before I could react to his provocation, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the heavy air from the edge of the circle. "Is there an issue here?" The sudden silence that enveloped the courtyard felt heavier than any threat Tyler could have screamed, because the illusion of his untouchable status had just cracked wide open in front of the very people he had intimidated for months. Calvin Kane took a slow, calculated step forward, his polished, expensive demeanor instantly sliding back into place like a well-rehearsed mask as he scanned the crowd with practiced innocence. Tyler looked up from the dirt, his face burning with humiliation, and whined to his father that Chloe had caused the incident and that I had assaulted him on camera. Calvin offered a gentle, patronizing smile toward my daughter, a gesture that felt infinitely more sickening than outright rage. "Now, young lady, public festivals get entirely too emotional," Calvin said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "My son is under a great deal of athletic pressure, and accidents happen." That was when Silas Vance finally stepped past me, his weathered face tight with a bitter, exhausted disgust. "Calvin, your son has been terrorizing people around this town for months, and you know it," Silas snapped. Calvin's smile didn't flicker, but his eyes turned glacial. "Be very careful what you say, Silas." And right there, the ugly architecture of the town's corruption lay exposed for everyone to see. Tyler wasn't just a spoiled bully because he knew how to fight, but because his wealthy father had built an ecosystem where victims learned that staying silent was the only way to survive. Chloe's voice shook as she looked across at Calvin, her hands trembling violently against her sides. "He waited outside the diner where I work after closing time," she whispered, the words tumbling out as the dam finally broke. "He blocked my car in the alley last month. I reported it to my shift manager, but she told me not to push it because his family sponsors the entire district." I turned my head slowly, looking down at my daughter with a cold, sinking horror in my chest. "You never mentioned any of this to me, Chloe." She lowered her gaze, blinking back tears. "I didn't want you to get hurt, Dad, or get arrested trying to protect me." That single sentence sliced deeper than any razor, breaking something inside me with the quiet finality of old iron chains snapping underwater. I turned my sights from Tyler to Calvin, and then swept my gaze across the stunned faces of the recording crowd. "What happens to the next girl who tells him no?" I asked quietly into the stillness. Nobody dared to laugh. Realizing he was losing control of the narrative, Tyler panicked and lunged back toward the center of the canvas. "Fight me right now, you coward, or admit you're nothing!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. I closed my eyes for a single heartbeat, letting go of the last remnants of the fear that had haunted me for over a decade. The terrifying fear that stepping back into a ring would awaken the violent ghost I had buried so long ago. I let go of Chloe's hand, ignoring Silas as he frantically grabbed my forearm and whispered a final warning not to cross that line. I looked the old trainer in the eye and told him the truth. "I'm not going back to who I was, Silas," I said softly. "I'm just ending this without becoming him." Tyler ripped off his crimson jacket, baring his tattooed shoulders and wrapped hands as he bounded onto the canvas like a caged animal, while Calvin stood by and watched in silent complicity. I rolled my sleeves up past my elbows, and for the very first time, Chloe noticed the thick, pale scars crisscrossing my knuckles. "Why did he ever stop fighting?" she asked Silas, her voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. Silas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Because the last man who forced him to fight didn't stand up for a very long time. Your father won that night, but he hated what winning turned him into." The crowd around the center of the asphalt square remained frozen, holding their breath as the flashing emergency lights of the arriving security vehicle cut long, harsh crimson arcs across the stunned faces of the onlookers. Tyler stood there near the canvas, his breath coming in ragged, humiliated gasps, his entire posture collapsing inward as he realized that the absolute power he thought he wielded was nothing more than a fragile illusion built entirely on other people's fear. Calvin tried to step forward, his expensive clothes and practiced smile suddenly looking entirely out of place, but the universal rejection of the crowd pinned him in place. Silas Vance stood right beside him, his shoulders squared, refusing to back down from the man who had enabled and protected local cruelty for far too long. I kept my body positioned protectively between my daughter and the unfolding chaos, feeling the lingering adrenaline slowly recede from my veins as the true weight of what we had just survived settled over my shoulders. The security officer stepped past the perimeter tape, his gaze hardening as he took in the discarded metal chair, the broken tension in the air, and the overwhelming wall of eyewitnesses who were suddenly eager to speak up. Chloe reached out, her fingers finding mine once again, but this time her grip wasn't desperate or terrified. It was steady, warm, and grounded in a newfound strength that she didn't know she possessed. The officer looked directly at Tyler and his father, gesturing toward the patrol car waiting by the perimeter. "Both of you need to step away from the mat and come with us right now," the officer commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tyler's face twisted in desperate disbelief as he looked around the circle for any friend, any ally, anyone who would step up to defend him. But the crowd simply stared back in cold, unbroken silence. That was the ultimate reality of what happened out there in the open sun. Bullies are entirely alone the second the people they have terrorized decide to stop being afraid. Calvin tried one last desperate attempt at manipulation, his voice tight with false authority. "You are making a massive mistake, officer. My legal team will—" But he was cut off by half a dozen voices from the crowd, calling out simultaneously, confirming the harassment, the threats, and the physical assault with absolute clarity. Silas turned his tired, weathered eyes toward Calvin one last time, delivering a final truth that shook the older man to his core. "Your empire of intimidation is finished, Calvin," Silas said quietly. "The board is taking over the academy, and every single victim you tried to silence is finally going to be heard." The heavy silence of the evening commute swallowed the sirens and the flashing police lights as we finally pulled away from the festival grounds, the distant hum of traffic blending with the steady thrum of the engine beneath my hands. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty highway ahead, my fingers gripping the steering wheel, while Chloe rested her head against the passenger side window, watching the blur of street lamps melt into the gathering dusk. The viral videos and online debates would rage on for days, strangers dissecting the confrontation, arguing over whether the outcome was justified, or questioning every split-second decision made under the glaring festival lights. But the people who had actually stood in that square understood something far deeper and more enduring than any digital commentary ever could. True strength was never about the volume of a threat or the empty swagger of an inherited empire. It was about looking devastation dead in the eye, holding absolute power on a hair trigger, and choosing restraint over destruction simply because your child is watching. As I pulled the truck into our gravel driveway and cut the engine, the familiar quiet of our yard wrapped around us like a shield, offering a profound sense of sanctuary after the chaos of the day. Chloe lingered by the passenger door for a moment before following me up the wooden porch steps, her expression thoughtful and clear of the shadows that had haunted her for months. "Dad," she called out softly as I unlocked the front door. I turned to look at her, my heart aching with a fierce, protective love. "Yeah, kiddo." She looked down at her hands, then straight into my eyes with a newfound maturity that caught me completely off guard. "I'm glad we went today, even with everything that happened. I think we both needed to see that we aren't as helpless as we thought." I reached out and pulled her into a quiet, steady embrace, realizing right then that the invisible walls between us had finally crumbled away into nothing. The lessons we carry from our past do not define who we are forced to become. They simply remind us of the choices we have every single day to protect the people we love.